With 100% certainty, I can tell you, if you were to pull up any news website and click on the little tab that says News in the Middle East, I guarantee you're going to find some bad news. And recently, there's been a bombing. There's been some kind of terrorist activity. There's been some kind of violence or threat of violence on any given day. The dispute about the Holy Land, the Middle East, has come up again recently in the news. I know with the U.S. talking about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That has come back into the news. But really, the Middle East has never left the news. And the sermon this morning about the conflict in the Middle East, how we got here and what we're going to do, that is not in response to anything that's happened in the news lately. We could have talked about this topic any given day of the year. It just happens to be the time that it is rolled up as we're studying through Genesis. But we could have talked about this any given day of the year, and guess what? I could say the same thing, that something has happened the night before. Because there's always something happening in the Middle East. There's always news about the Middle East. There's so much news that for us, it doesn't really feel like news anymore, does it? Feels just like a thing that's constantly happening. It is almost like white noise. And because we are separated away from it on the other side of the world, it seems very much like a thing that's over there. It's not something we deal with day in and day out of sight, out of mind. But God's people, the Jewish people, we have been grafted into that tree. This affects us too. That is our family over there in a spiritual sense. So what happens to God's people in the Holy Land should be of some consequence to us too. That should matter to us. Even though, again, there's always news about the Middle East. And it's hard to keep up with it all the time. So we're going to talk about this a little bit this morning. About how did we get to this point where there's so much conflict, there's so much strife in the Middle East. How did we get to this point? And where do we go from here? When you look through the Bible, the answers are right there. It tells you in a lot of detail. And if you look at your notes this morning, you say, sure, we're not going to read every single word of all of these. No, we're going to do some highlights. But I want you to have this information so that you can look at it later and think, oh, all of these answers are in the Bible. The Bible spells out very clearly why we are at this point and where it is all headed. When we look at the explanation for how we got here, it's very simple, but it's also very heartbreaking. And what we're going to do about it involves a lot of love, a lot of understanding. It means being a witness in the world, and hopefully by what we believe, what we show in our beliefs to the rest of the world, hopefully we can change some hearts and change some minds. If we change some just here in Nash County, we change some hearts and minds, we'll have been doing some great work for the kingdom of God. So we're going to start the story with Abraham. At this point in the story, his name is not Abraham yet, it's Abram. And his wife, Sarah, is not Sarah yet, she's Sarai. But when we look at the story of Abram, or Abraham, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all trace back their heritage to Abraham. When we look at the book of Genesis that we've been going through, the Christians, we believe a lot of what is written in the Jewish text. In other words, the Old Testament that we have is the scriptures for the Jews. We look at that story, we read the same story. So we agree with the Jews on the account of Abraham. Now, we as Christians, we take that a step further because we have the writings of Paul that say, yes, there was a covenant made to Abraham and his bloodline, but we as Christians, we say we are not bloodline successors to Abraham, we are spiritual successors to Abraham. That we are grafted into the tree. And those notes are inside of your, that scripture is inside of your notes, but I'll just reference a little bit of this. In Romans 11, chapter 11, verses 11 through 31, we see that salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. It's verse 17. You, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root. Do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. Let's skip down to verse 25. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Verse 28. They are loved on account of the patriarchs, for God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. So I know we've skipped around there in a little bit because we want to get a lot of this content in today. But to just sum up a few points, God has a plan for Israel through the patriarchs like Abraham. God made a promise through Abraham and his descendants, and God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. And God is true to his word. And the hearts of Israel has hardened for some time. There are many Israelites who are not accepting Jesus as the Messiah that they read about, and there are some who do. There are some Jewish people who accept that the Messiah has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But there are a lot of hearts who have been hardened. They say, no, this can't be the Messiah. This can't be. And those hearts have been hardened until the full number of the Gentiles come in. So we are the Gentiles. We're not from the bloodline. But God is waiting. And I just picture him eagerly at the door. I picture Jesus with his hand on the doorknob, waiting for the command from God the Father. When can I go through that door and come and get my people? But when the last one is saved. When the last person is saved, that's when you come back and get them all. So God lets us Christians in on the promise of Abraham through Jesus. And so that's how we as Christians interpret the story. We read the Jewish scriptures in Genesis. We interpret them in light of the New Testament, that we are grafted into that tree. But Muslims take a very different stance. They rewrite major sections of the story of Abraham. And we're going to see that in a little bit. So we're going to kind of skim through a little bit of a recap of some of the promises that God made to Abraham in the chapters we've read so far. So God in chapter 12 of Genesis speaks to Abraham, and this is all inside your notes. And Abraham at this point is still named Abram. And God makes him a promise. Chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So far, so good. God is giving a blessing through Abram and his descendants to come. He's also saying, if you're on the wrong side of Abram, if you curse Abram, then you're calling down a curse upon yourself. Now keep that in mind. You'll see that later. Those who curse Abram and his descendants, the favored bloodline, Israel, if you curse them, you are calling down a curse upon yourself. That has notes for world history today. God continues the promise to Abram in chapter 13. Let's skip down to verse 15. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. So now, in addition to the promise of countless offspring, there's also the addition of the land. The land is linked to the promise. That's important. Chapter 15, in verse 4. This will be a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Verse 18. To your descendants I give this land. And then we see some descriptors of the people who were in the land. So now there's even more specificity in the promises of God. This son that happens, the promise will come through this son. This will be your own flesh and blood. Abram thinks, oh, it's going to be someone who is in my household who's a servant because I don't have any children. Eliezer, God says, no, this will be your own flesh and blood. Don't be going and looking for one of your servants to fulfill this promise. Again, you're going to hear that again in a moment. And this land that you're getting is already occupied by a lot of other people. A lot of other people groups. And so all of those promises that we've been talking about bring us to chapter 16. So starting with verse 1 in chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." And let's stop right there for just a moment. The Lord has made some huge promises, and there are promises that can only be fulfilled through the son of promise. They involve Abram and Sarai having a child of their own flesh and blood in order for this to happen. Now, why hasn't this happened yet? We can just chalk it up to the timing of the Lord. God's timing is not always our timing. Sometimes we have to wait. We've been talking about that, how we have to wait on God sometimes, and it seems like it takes so long. And we know when we follow the journey that Abram has been on, that all of these things that have happened in his life, from Genesis 12 up to chapter 16, all of these things that keep on happening, he builds in his faith. There's a struggle, there's some kind of waiting for God's promise, and it just builds on his faith. We have this faith that is credited by God as righteousness. So we see Abram's faith is growing and growing and growing through each of these trials that he's on. That works for us, by the way. Sometimes when God has you waiting and he lets you go through some things, that is to build your faith. And your faith is supposed to increase and increase and increase as you're constantly relying upon God to get you through. Maybe we can all think of some examples in our lives where you go through a trial and you say, God's the only one who will get me through this. I can't figure it out. I'm not strong enough, intellectually, physically, whatever it is. I can't get myself through this trial. God's got to get me through it or I'm not going to make it. So that works for us as well. This waiting builds our faith. But what does Sarai do here? Sarai seems to not believe the promise. She point blank blames God for keeping her from having children. She doesn't say the Lord has been delaying. He's going to do this later. She says he has kept her from the promise happening at all. God has kept me from having children. So she doesn't seem to think that this is going to happen the way that God has promised it to happen. Because if she did believe the promises of God, she wouldn't do what she does next. There's no way she would do what she does next. There was this practice that they used to do in the land of Haran, where Abram and Sarai had recently lived. They moved from there into the Promised Land. On the way to the Promised Land, there was this practice that they did in Haran, where if you could not have children, but you owned a slave, you could have your spouse sleep with the slave and they'd have a child. And because the slave belonged to you and they were property, then that slave child was then your child. They were your property. And I'm not saying it's right at all, but that's the thing that they did in Haran. That was the mindset at the time. So Abram and Sarai, they have left the land of Haran, and they've taken that custom with them. They had that in the back of their mind to say, you know what they used to do in Haran? Now here they are in the Promised Land. They should move past those customs of that old country. But they are drawing back to what happened to Haran. You know what we can do? Remember what they used to do back in the last place we lived? I think we should do that. Now, do you ever do that? God gives you a new mind and a new heart, a new mindset. He's brought you back out of the former land. You're in a new and better place, but you fall back on that old way of thinking. Stuff that maybe you didn't even agree with, but it's somebody else's idea, and you say, you know what? I think I like it back there. I think I like the way they used to do things back there. We fall back into old patterns of thinking, old ideas that are not really the best ideas for us, but we're so desperate, and we're tired of waiting on God, we fall back on old ideas. We come up with some solutions that are not really good solutions. In Romans 12, verse 2, it says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So it seems like what we're seeing here in this passage is the opposite of that, allowing the world to change your thinking about things. They have allowed those old practices from Haran to change their thinking about what they should do next. And if you do that, you're going to miss God's will for you in the matter. And maybe that is a word for you in your situation. You say, I want to know what God's will is. Well, you can't fall back on that old way of thinking. You've got to let God renew you through the transforming of your mind. If you really want to know what God's will is for your life, what you should be doing in that situation, are you allowing him to renew your mind? Or are you falling back on that old way of thinking? We see in this chapter, it says, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Now, depending on the translation that you read, this essentially means that Abram listened to his wife and did what she said. If you go into the King James or the English Standard Version, he listened to his wife, he did what she said. Now, husbands, don't misunderstand the next thing I'm going to say. Don't go home and tell your wife, Pastor said I don't have to listen to you. Don't misunderstand me. That's not going to work for me either. But I want to call to your attention, to your recollection, a passage way back in Genesis 3. What did God say after Adam sinned? In chapter 3, after Eve ate of the forbidden fruit and she gave some to her husband, and he who was with her ate of it, what happens? What does God say about Adam's sin? Chapter 3, verse 17. To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it, all the days of your life. Now men, we're supposed to be the spiritual head of the household and guide our family towards Christ. We're supposed to guide our family towards God. That's not exactly what happens here. What happens with Adam is that his wife has a bad idea, and instead of saying, you know what, we should really not do that because God told us not to, he just says, okay. He relegates his responsibility. He's supposed to guide the family back. It's not a position of authority to be abused. It's an awesome and humbling responsibility from God to draw this, to keep the vehicle on the road, so to speak, towards God. But what Adam does is he relegates his position. He just kind of goes, okay, to this bad idea. And then what happens when God comes down and calls him out on it? Well, it was Eve's fault. It was this woman you gave me. She's defective. I need to send her back. He throws his wife underneath the bus. What does Abram do here? We're going to see that a little bit in a moment. Abram hears a bad idea from his wife, and hey, he should listen to his wife. He should hear her out and see what she has to say. He does need to listen. But at this point, Abram should have stepped in and said, no, I don't think we need to do that. God told us we would have a child. He's been making these promises chapter after chapter. God's been making these promises. I think we should wait on God. We've been waiting this far. It's not like their clock is running out. The clock's already run out. There's no way biologically this can happen except for a miracle. So it's not like, oh, the time is running low. It's, let's continue to wait on God. So Abram should have brought the conversation back. He should have guided his household in faith. We'll see later on, and we'll talk about this another Sunday, how God specifically commands Abram to guide his family in faith. But that's a topic for another Sunday. Abram should have said, let's be patient. Abram could have thought this through and thought about the godly response to this and say, what if we rush God's plan? What if we have a child outside the promise and then God gives us a child within the promise? What's going to happen? That's going to be some division. Abram should have thought that through because that's what happens. So in verse 3, so after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So there's a lot of different family dynamics going on in this particular part of the passage. Abram has put the responsibility on his wife instead of keeping with God's plan. Now Sarai is blaming Abram, and Abram's ready to throw Hagar under the bus. He said, do whatever you want to with her. After he's just essentially used her, just do whatever you want to with her, mistreat her, I don't care. So Hagar is full of hatred for her master, Sarai. Being forced into sex will do that for you. Being told that the child that you're going to bear, the child of the promise, is not going to be your child, that's going to belong to somebody else. That would make you resentful, wouldn't it? Being told that child's going to be taken away from you, that's going to be the child of the promise. You're still not in the promise. You're on the outside looking in. You were the one who carried that child for 9 months, and you give him up. You could see why Hagar would have some resentment issues here. In verse 7, after Hagar has run away, verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me, for she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. This is why the well was called Beer-lahai-roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. Now, I don't want you to miss the heart of what's going on here in this passage. I want you to put yourself in Hagar's shoes. You've been mistreated in the worst possible ways, and you're bitter, and understandably so. And finally, someone has seen your suffering. That person that's seen your suffering is God himself. He's seen your suffering. You say, this is the God who sees me. Nobody else sees me. No one else cares about me but God. God sees me. So she's got this special relationship with God. And God tells her something special about the son that she's going to give birth to. He's going to have a lot of descendants. He's going to be the father of many nations, but it's not the kind of promise. It's not the kind of legacy you want for your child to have and to pass down. That this child, he's going to be at war with everybody. Everybody on the outside of the family, he's going to be at war with them. Everybody on the inside of the family, he's going to be at war with them. He's going to find no peace. That's the legacy that your son is going to have. Now, if you're Hagar, you've had this story, and you're about to turn back around and you're going to go to Sarai, you're going to go submit to your master who's been abusing you. You've got this story of this time you've encountered God, and you have been unwanted. Your child is going to one day be unwanted. You're going to tell that story to your children, aren't you? You're going to tell them about the time that you met God in the desert, everything that had happened to you, how you fled. You're going to tell that story. You're going to tell the story to the children, and it's going to be part of the family history. Now, what does that do to your identity? That line of the family, when you've got that in your history, and that's the story that gets told, what does that do to your family line? And that's your story. In verse 15, so Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. And when we go down to chapter 17, in verse 4, this is another encounter that Abram has with God. And this is God speaking to Abram. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Going down to verse 15. God also said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her, and I will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. Don't miss that. Her. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Then God said to him, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. So this chapter makes it very clear. Abram and Sarai, their identity has been changed to Abraham and Sarah. So their identity is founded in the changing of their names. The names signify that they will be the father and mother of many nations, that they will have many children, many descendants. So their identity is founded and changed upon the promises of God. He changes their name because of that. And these names tie into the promise, the covenant of what is to come. And Hagar and Ishmael, they're not part of that promise. They are part of a promise. They're not part of the main promise. There will be a lot of descendants from Ishmael, but there will be a violent, murderous people. Now, ironically, Ishmael will be the father of 12 rulers. If you know a little bit ahead in the story, Israel, God's chosen people, the promised line, will be 12 tribes. We see this in the Bible a lot, where God is doing something through the promised line and the devil tries to do a mirror image, kind of an evil mirror image of it, to tweak it slightly. Yes, I have 12 rulers 12 rulers too, but they're going to be a murderous bunch. So God has his promised line of the family of Isaac. This will become Israel later on. And the devil tries to use the family line of Ishmael, who will become enemies of the people of God later on in our story. If you look at chapter 18 in your notes, and you can read that later, you'll find the story of how God shows up in the form of 3 visitors and repeats this promise to Abraham. Sarah's in the tent making them lunch. She overhears this and she laughs. God has commanded them to name this child Isaac. So I want you to notice that Abraham laughed first, and then Sarah laughed second. And they have to name their child Isaac, which means laughter. God has the last laugh. Now in chapter 21, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. We're going to skip down to verse 8 and read the story of Hagar. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away in this part. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So what can we learn about the identity of the Ishmaelites from this chapter? We know that they are the unwanted children, not the children of the main promise. They're children of a promise, but not the promise. They have a legacy, but it's not a legacy that you would want for your children. It's a legacy of violence. And we've already said that anyone who curses Abraham's chosen bloodline will be calling down a curse on themselves. And we see that happening throughout the Bible and in present day. At about this time, Ishmael is about 14 years old when they're celebrating the birth of Isaac. And we can understand how he might be resentful, because he was born to be a child of promise, and he's not going to be the child of promise. We can see how he's resentful, how he's bitter, and that seems to be what happens in this celebration of Isaac. And you can imagine how he might pass down that resentment, that bitterness, to his descendants. As Hagar tells some of the story, as he has seen this, as he's mocking, and as he is sent away, how this becomes part of his family's story, his family line going down throughout the generations of the Ishmaelites, who are on the wrong side of the tracks. Now there's an old legend, and I couldn't find the source material for this, but there's this old legend that the Ishmaelites traveled as Israel traveled. So Israel would be on one side of a stream, the Ishmaelites would be on the other side of the stream. And that for some time, they also worshipped Yahweh, our Old Testament name for God. That the Jews worshiped God, the Ishmaelites worshiped God, but they were on the wrong side of the tracks. They were on the wrong side of the stream. So when Israel would pick up camp and they would go, that some of the Ishmaelites would go. But eventually they were led away by foreign influences. And if you think about the bitter resentment that you're on the outside looking in, you can see what happens next. We've got chapter 25 in your notes. If you read chapter 25, we see that Abraham sends other children away. So he has children through concubines, he sends them away as well. Just like he sent Hagar and Ishmael away, he sends them with gifts, and he sends them to the east. Now, if you think back to some of our earlier reading in Genesis, the east kind of connotates bad. You want things that are evil or wicked or not of God, you want them to the east of you. So he sends them away to the east. And when Abraham dies, he gives everything that he owns to Isaac. He sent some gifts to the concubines and their children, but he gives everything that he owns to Isaac. And so they're having this funeral, and Isaac and Ishmael are both present at the funeral and bury their father. And you can only imagine what's going on through Ishmael's head. Over the years, I've been to a lot of funerals. Most of them go off very smoothly. I've seen some fights break out at funerals, unfortunately. Not physical. Police will call it. It was a long story. But I've seen some things happen at funerals, and you probably know of some stories where someone has had a custody dispute in the middle of a funeral, or a dispute over some kind of property. Unfortunately, sometimes these things happen. You can only imagine what's going on in Ishmael's heart, because he's got nothing. He's got none of the inheritance. He probably thought at some point, yes, I'm the child of promise. This belongs to me. I'm supposed to be the chosen bloodline, and it has not happened for him. So in the rest of the chapter, we have the family line listed out from Ishmael. And if you've read ahead in the Old Testament, as you read these names of Ishmael's descendants, you might say, hey, this sounds familiar. Didn't they go to war with Israel? Yeah, they sure did. This family line will become the future enemies of God's people. But skip ahead, about 2006 years into the future. From this time in Genesis, skip ahead about 2006 years. There's this man named Muhammad. And he goes into a cave and he encounters a demon. And this demon compels him to recite. Recite. It chokes the life out of him about 3 times. Now, in the thought of that region that kind of influences Islam, they had this belief, and we talk about this, but it actually comes from Islam. They had this belief that there were different types of angels, good angels and bad angels, and one might sit on this shoulder and one might sit on that shoulder. Does that sound familiar to you? You've heard about the good angel and the bad angel. That's actually an idea from Islam. They call these angels jinn, which is where we get our term genie. So if you've ever watched Aladdin or any of those kind of things, that actually comes from Islam. So Muhammad, he encounters a jinn, a demon. He doesn't know if it's a good jinn or a bad jinn, but it keeps on choking the life out of him and telling him to recite. And eventually on the 3rd time that it does this, that it attacks him, he starts reciting these words. And he writes them down, and that's how the Quran is born, that the holy book of Islam. So he recites it. He gets home to his wife. He's got this book in his hands. He's probably covered in sweat. And he says, I got to tell you what happened. I had this encounter in a cave, and I don't know if it was an angel or a demon. And he tells his wife about this, and she says, I think it was an angel. So she hears everything that he has to say. She says, I think it was an angel. And he listens to his wife. He doesn't guide them back into a godly understanding here. He listens to what his wife says, and he is kind of losing his role as the spiritual head here, and he accepts what she says, and now Islam is born. Now, if you look at pages of the Quran, I've studied some of that. It speaks out directly against Judaism and Christianity. And you can see the influence of what happened to Ishmael. You can see it in the pages of the Quran. Muslims claim to be the true physical and spiritual descendants of Ishmael. They say, we're his family line. So they are the line of Ishmael. And they claim that Ishmael was the child of the promise, not Isaac. So they will say when Moses had the 5 books of the Bible that the Jews and the Christians refer to, they'll say, well, he mishandled it. He didn't write it down right. We've got the true testament that was in the Quran. So they rewrite large portions of the story of Abraham to say that Ishmael was the child of promise. They teach that God is not a father and he does not have a son. And doesn't that sound like the story of Ishmael, who didn't really have a father in the end, didn't feel like a son? One author wrote that in a spiritual sense, Islam is the broken and bitter cry of Ishmael. So today we're living with the repercussions of the Ishmaelites in the form of radical Islam. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that every person who is a Muslim is a radical and is out to kill us. I am not going to paint this entire group of people with so broad a brush. There are a lot of wonderful, great people who In Islam, they are believing a lie. That does not make them horrible people. That does not mean that everybody from Islam is represented by groups of like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I know probably there are a lot of people who are Muslim that would say, we're not with them, they don't speak for us. So I do not want to make this a thing against all people who believe that. Yes, they believe a lie, but that does not mean that they are horrible people. So I want to make that very clear. We're not trying to stereotype all Muslim people when I say this. But there are some Muslim people who are radicalized, and that number seems to be growing. And a lot of the teaching there is that there can be no peace in the Middle East. You hear this a lot when there have been attempts at peace between Israel and Pakistan. There's been a lot of statements that there can be no peace. The only thing that needs to happen is all the Jews need to be destroyed. All the Christians need to be destroyed. I saw a clip on the news some years ago, and I wish I had a way to have saved it. This was back before the internet, probably, or when it was very young. But it was video of Al-Qaeda at the time running through a training course, shooting targets that each target had a cross on them. That where they were training, if you see a Christian, you kill them. So there is a growing number of people who do want to kill Jews, who do want to kill Christians, who are radicalized. And the Bible teaches, when we look back at Ishmael, that he'll be a wild donkey of a man and no one will be able to control him. We see that through the pages of the Bible. We see it now. And the Bible teaches it will be that way until Jesus returns. So we've asked the question from the beginning, how did we get to this point? That's how we got to this point. And the next question is, what do we do about it? What are we going to do about this thing that we see in the news every single day? And we're talking about it more and more. What are we going to do about this? The first of all is we do not demonize the adherents to Islam. Though they believe a lie, and though they're basing their lives around it, this does not mean that all Muslims are bad people. We do not show hatred to them. That's going to get us nowhere. We don't show hatred to them. They may be believing a lie, but we separate out those who are just believing a lie versus those who wish to harm us. Those are not the same thing. Just because someone is a Muslim does not mean they are in that group of people who want to harm us. So if we want to act hurtful towards them, they're not going to come to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. If we stereotype them, they're not going to come to the truth. Second of all, we realize that anybody can come to the truth. No one is irredeemable. You've heard me say that before, but I want to repeat it. No one is irredeemable. We realize that even though someone might even be a radical extremist, they can convert to Christianity. You go on YouTube and type in ISIS fighter verse, and you'll see video after video of people that God has somehow got from behind the lines of ISIS and plucked them out and made them a believer in Jesus Christ. You see it a lot. You don't see it on the news, but you can find these stories. In Luke 6, verse 27, Jesus says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." Thirdly, we also realize the difference between the false narrative and the truth. We are being told by certain sources that the reason that people join ISIS and these radical groups is because of poverty, and ISIS and all these groups promise to bring them out of poverty. For some people, that's true. For some people, they are in poverty and they use ISIS as a way to supposedly get out of poverty. But we've actually found that if you actually go to the Middle East and talk to people, a lot of people who are converting to these radical groups are middle-class people with a large education. We actually have people in America who are being converted through the internet, through video games. ISIS is reaching out to them and pulling them in. It's really scary if you think about it. Watch what your kids do online, because there's a lot of ISIS activity trying to bring kids in. So it's true for some people that they come to it because of poverty, and we definitely need to address poverty and try to take care of people and show them Jesus through acts of giving. But we also have to know that it's not just that. We have to live out in our words and our actions. We have to educate in a different way. They're being educated wrong about these terrorist groups. We have to show the truth, because they're being taught Christians are evil. Christians need to die. Christians are hateful people. Prove them wrong. Be the kind of witness where someone who has been radicalized, and maybe you don't even know it, maybe you work beside them, you live beside them, when they see your life, don't you want them to say, this can't be right. This can't be right. I was taught that Christians were bad people. These are the most loving people I know. I've never seen anything like I see in these Christians. They cannot possibly be as bad as what ISIS has told me they are. There's got to be something to this. Live the kind of life that makes them question, that makes them curious, that guides them to say, you know what, I want to get to know this Christian. I want to know what it's really like to be a Christ follower. Make your faith such an appealing faith that they say, I want that. I don't want what I've been carrying around, this hatred, this desire to kill other people, this false narrative. I don't want that. I want what they've got, because what they've got is the real deal. What these Christians have is the real deal. I want that. Fourthly, we realize that even a radical can come to Jesus. In 1 Timothy 2:4, it says that God wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Back when Osama bin Laden was alive, I used to always, when I thought about Osama bin Laden, I always thought about the Apostle Paul. Because what did Paul do before he was a Christian? He went out and he persecuted Christ followers. He went out and killed them. And I always thought, man, wouldn't it have been great if Osama bin Laden had converted? And I know that sounds naive, and obviously it didn't happen. But I always thought it could. Because if it could happen for Saul, who became Paul, it could happen for anybody. If God can convert the biggest enemy of the faith to the biggest advocate for the faith, he could do that with anybody. So you remember the story of Paul, we say, we should really be praying for these people who are radicalized and want to kill us. Now we might say in our hearts, well, all I really want is for them to die. I want us to bomb them. I want us to do whatever we can to kill them. I understand a need to defend our nation. I get that. But we also need to be praying that God converts these people before it ever gets to that point. So that we're not in an armed conflict with them, that God changes their hearts. We have a duty to reach everybody, and no one is irredeemable. And fifth and lastly, we acknowledge where all of this is going, and we try to bring as many people to heaven with us as possible. In Isaiah 46, verse 10, God says, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. So we see here in Isaiah what has been proclaimed from the beginning. We also see from this passage that in the end, God will bring his splendor to all people. So God knows what's going to happen. He's prophesied it. He's not surprised by it. He knows the end. And he knows that there will be a lot of people converted, a lot of people drawn to Christ. So I'll summarize it in brief. I know we've gone a little bit longer, but we've explained through the book of Genesis the entire Middle Eastern conflict, so it went a little bit long. But just to sum her up a little bit, the radical extremism that threatens God's people today has been prophesied about in the Bible. It's very clear. We can see where it goes. And we can learn from the story of Abraham and Sarah that Abraham should have guided his household in faith towards the promises of God. And that's a command for all of us. And in particular, husbands, we are to listen to our wives. Don't go back and say, I told you not to listen to your wife. We're supposed to listen to our wife. We're supposed to hear her out. And she has a lot of good ideas. My wife has a lot of good ideas, and I do better to listen to her. There are times when we as husbands have to stand up for what God says, even if everybody else says, not just your family, but everybody in your family, your neighborhood, your workplace, if everybody says, go this way, but we know God commands this way, we have to stand up and say, it might make me unpopular, I might make people angry, but I got to step up for what's right in God. I got to make God happy, and that everything else will follow. So sometimes we do have to say, you know what, I'm going to have to stand up for what God says. And Abraham should have done that with the promise of God. Said, no, we're not going to have a slave through Hagar. We're going to stick with what God says. We're going to stick to the plan. We also learned the devil has tried to raise armies against God's people from the beginning. It's no surprise. It's nothing new. When we see it in the news, it's not news. It's nothing new. We also read that family dysfunction that is not dealt with can have repercussions for generations to come. We see that with the Ishmaelites. Family dysfunction can keep carrying. We can break the cycle, but it's hard. So we have to do our work now to hopefully not pass down that kind of dysfunction. And we keep that out of our families through our relationship with God. And lastly, not every Muslim wants to be our enemies. Not every Muslim wants to be our enemies, but for those that do, for those who raise their hand and say, oh, I'm your enemy, Jesus commands us to love our enemies. So we pray for them. We show them through our example that we are not a people to be hated or feared or to attacked, but that what we've got is the real deal. What God has put inside of us is the real and only truth. Now, if you don't have that truth inside of you this morning, and you say, I don't have that relationship with God, but I want it, don't go home today without addressing that. If you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, I would love to talk to you. We're going to sing one last song. I'd love for you to come forward, and let's pray about it. Let's talk about it. Let's pray about it. I'd love to meet with you. You might want to kneel down here at the pulpit and have that conversation with God. Whatever it is that God leads you to do today, won't you please come forward as we sing this final hymn.